Welcome to this edition of ArmCare IQ. We're going to go into the second part of isometrics. We talked about isometrics from a theoretical perspective before, where certain instances of the delivery have an isometric feature. And we're going to talk about training. We're going to get into some training concepts in this particular ArmCare IQ. If you like what you're listening to, please subscribe to us on YouTube and hit the like button, and also join us on our newsletter where we go into deeper detail on our ArmCare IQs, into our podcasts, and also has special offers on our products. So here we go. So let's talk about the volume load incompatibility between throwing and training. And this is the basis of why isometrics are so important. Let's start on the left. So when you look at the left and we look at throwing needs to be examined and has to be considered training. The total volume of throws in a game, let's just say it's a starter, it's 100 pitches. Now, when you calculate the compression loading, all the forces that are generated around the rotator cuff to keep the shoulder integrated, because the arm is moving at such high velocity, it's trying to distract. The arm is actually, trying to pull out of the socket, and all these muscles are keeping it integrated. So when you look at calculating those forces, they're over body weight, but converting them into pounds is roughly, for a 90-mile-an-hour fastball, is about 224 pounds. So when you multiply 100 pitches in a game times 224, you get the total volume load for a game, and that's 22,400 pounds. Now, that's not including the warm-up throws. And the warm-up throws, some pitchers take up to 75 throws before they even get in the bullpen to warm up before a game. It's very different. It's for some pitchers, they need more and some don't need as much. There's not an exact science. That's sort of a place where you need to communicate with your pitcher in terms of what's best for them. But we're talking about a heavy amount of load. And that's, in my mind, that throwing is training. Now, on the other spectrum, it's like, here's the ArmCare training. And the ArmCare training usually is very high volume. There's a lot of repetitions that are done in an ArmCare session. And if you look at this volume, it's done almost daily, especially in professional baseball. A lot of athletes are doing some form of ArmCare almost daily. But the problem is that the load per rep is very low. They're using light dumbbells under 5 pounds, or the athlete might be using cuff weights with very low irradiation. They're not getting a huge amount of shoulder activation. And so I've given an example. This is a particular athlete that's just lying on a table doing some form of scapular stabilization training. It's involving external rotator cuff. In this position, the external rotator cuff is activated pretty highly. And even though those aspects are going on, when you multiply the volume times the actual intensity or the force per rep, it's very low. And it's because the arm isn't accelerating as fast. We're looking at 5 pounds approximate to keep the shoulder integrated because it's not moving quickly. And the relationship between looking at the total volume load of throwing and the total volume load of training is inconsistent. And we're not even talking about throwing programming. So in my experience in professional baseball, I stood on the field with some of the hardest throwing pitchers in our organization at the major league level. And, a lot of them on a pull down, in doing pull downs, they were throwing, between 90 and 95% of their game velocities. And, that has a substantial amount of force. And if it wasn't in terms of a heavy pull down day, they were still throwing at 85% of their maximum velocity. So these guys, even though they're saying it's a light throwing day, they don't have a really good barometer of velocity. And they're definitely having a lot more volume load in throwing as training comparatively to what they're doing in the weight room with resistance. And we can't simulate that in training, easily. We could if we could take a very heavy weight and we could accelerate it fast. And, the physics tells us the higher, force equals mass times acceleration. So the higher the mass and the acceleration goes down, the force is going to go much lower. For us, it's just one of the relationships in terms of how force is calculated and how the muscles are going to be experiencing this force level. So we need to come up with an idea, a training concept that gives us time under tension and very high recruitment. And that can be accomplished with isometrics. So let's get to some isometric concepts. So these are overcoming isometrics. This means that we're not really going against gravity. We're pushing into something maximally. We're not changing position. We're not fighting the change of position. And this is an external rotation exercise. And I have on the graph, wherever you see the dots in the graph, that is the point in which the movement's isometric. There's no change in the joint angle. There's no velocity that can be achieved. Velocity equals 0. So this is the instant of maximal external rotation at 180 degrees. We talked about that before in the previous part 1. So you'll see an example that you can do using a stability ball. So I'm basically taking a stability ball, putting it on a motionless surface, and I'm pushing into it. And the thing that I like about the isometrics with the stability ball is you're fighting a little bit of perturbation. You're getting a little bit of co-contraction. You can see with my hands pushing in, the ball's moving slightly. And so there is this element of co-contraction around the training. And this has a high amount of time under tension. I'm pushing as hard as possible. So when you take those reps that are light dumbbell reps or cuff weight reps, I can spend more time doing isometric training, have greater time under tension, greater endurance benefits than doing those exercises alone. I'm not saying to completely abandon them, but we need to augment or at least reframe our mind to improve higher intensity components to our training. And it's done with isometrics and eccentrics, but we're going to be focusing on isometrics in this talk. So let's get to internal rotation. So you can see that the next dot at the minima level, the furthest low point, is when the athlete has their maximal internal rotation. So here in this particular example, when we looked at the biomechanics and we see that downward slope, we can see that that dot is at the 0 line where they're at 0 degrees rotation. So essentially it would be like here. I'm not into internal rotation. I'm not into external rotation. I'm basically neutral in terms of the rotation angle. So that would be at maximal internal rotation. And you want to be able to have strength isometrically in this position because we need to activate those internal rotator cuff muscles. If we can generate more strength, we can generate a little more force. We can accelerate the arm more, but we need to activate. And again, I'm going to give you another stability ball exercise. You can see there's some perturbation. Notice that I'm putting something under the elbow. I need to make mention of that I want to keep my shoulder aligned and I don't want to be hyperangulated. I don't want my shoulder to be popping upwards when I'm doing this activity because it could bother my shoulder. You can change the angle. So I'm doing these lying down, but you could do a 90-90 position if you wanted to and utilize this fixed surface and a stability ball. You can get creative with this. I'm just showing one example that really mirrors what we do with our dynamometer. And using our dynamometer in combination with our isometric training really produces great results. We want to ensure that the shoulder is as strong as possible. Strength matters most because it can handle more force. We don't lose cross-sectional area. We improve the neural recruitment. We want to ensure that we have isometrics in our diet of training. Here's a SCAPTION. So I didn't go into this in part 1, but when you look at now a long lever graph, so we're looking at shoulder abduction and adduction, you'll see at certain periods, especially when you look at shoulder abduction, you can see that the red dot is a point where you get to the bottom and you can't make any slope with that. That's where we're at an isometric point at ball release. So at ball release, our shoulder abduction angle, in terms of our arm being raised up, or elevation angle to make it easier, is fixed at ball release. It's not moving all around. It's at that ball release, there's an instant of isometric positioning. And we see that too with horizontal ab and adduction. You can see external rotation, just like how we had the maximal external rotation angle, we had an instant of an isometric period, an isometric instant. We have an isometric instant too with horizontal adduction. You can see it's ahead of 0. 0 would be if my arm is completely even with my shoulder. Ahead of 0 means it's ahead of my shoulder line. Behind 0 obviously is where it's hyperangulated behind me, and you can see that into horizontal abduction at the beginning slope of that particular graph. So those are some important points that we're looking at different changes in position. So, looking at SCAPTION, we are gaining strength in that isometric capacity for our arm abduction, but we're also, in terms of the motion that is front and back of the arm, you can see in the position I'm lying down, and my arm is at a 45-degree angle from the ground. I've raised my arm up, so we're putting our arm into an isometric position that has some relationship to what's going on in throwing, and we need to improve our isometric force in a long lever position. So that's important too. We talked about external and internal, but we need to develop force in a long lever position, because that's where the highest forces, those compression loads, are occurring. And if you think back to that volume load illustration that I had, you can see that the athletes are experiencing like 225 pounds. I mean, ideally 224 pounds of what I calculated in conversion to pounds in that position. So we need to have maximum force in that position. I can't stress it enough. So here's an example here when I press through. Now you can see there's a lot more perturbation. So there's a little more co-contraction because I have less surface area on the ball. It's my hand, my forearm's not touching it, and I have to stop it from rolling. It's also elevated a little bit higher. So this is something for the overcoming SCAPTION isometrics, and you can get creative with this. There's lots of different ways to achieve training this way. So these are just some examples. I want to talk about yielding isometrics. So when it's a yielding isometric, essentially you're stopping the downward motion of a body segment. Let's just say I'm in a lunge. Let's take a lunge. If I go down to my lunge, my bottom position, and I hold it in an isometric position, that's a yielding isometric, because I'm stopping my center of gravity from going lower and deeper into the lunge. I'm going against gravity. And this is kind of the same concept when we look at the upper body. So I'm giving you an example again. How can we improve the isometric capacity of our muscles in our external rotators? And this one is it's a 90 position, 90 degrees of shoulder abduction, and I'm at a 90-degree elbow bend. And you can use a kettlebell. I like kettlebells or aspects of kettlebells that there's more force under the hand grip. If I have a dumbbell, it gets distributed a little bit differently because I have an evenness about the load on either side of my hand. But now I've got this bottom loaded surface that it's trying to bring me down. It's giving me a little bit of this mass moment of inertia. The distribution of mass is further below my hand, so it can increase the effort driven by my shoulder. So I'm going to show you this one. I'm supported on the wall. I keep my rib cage down. I got my core integrated. I've taken my pelvis and I'm actually posterior tilting it. So I'm trying to create a neutral spine in this position as well. On a wall, it might be a little bit easier that you can feel how to orient your pelvis, so you have a little bit better alignment. But here I am as I'm holding this thing, 20-second hold. And this is an external rotation isometric yield. And I think it's just great. I think it's great to incorporate it. This weight is 20 pounds. So I'm holding a 20-pound weight. And, generally in my mind for yielding isometrics, you want to start a little bit under 10% body weight with an athlete that's new to this. And you'll probably work yourself up to about 15% body weight. It starts to get pretty difficult to hold on to. You want to think about time under tension because you're developing endurance through the isometric training as well. So this is just one example. There's lots of things you can do with our yielding isometrics. Here's an internal rotation yielding isometric. So again, the weight of the ball, it's also improving my grip strength. That as it's moving down, I'm trying to do the best I possibly can to not let that dumbbell, I'm using a crossover symmetry ball to hit the ground. I don't want it to go behind me. And I'm gripping that thing and I'm keeping my internal rotator cuff turned on. And it's a yielding isometric again, time under tension, building strength. I'm on the ground, so I'm also elevating my elbow, so it's got better alignment. My shoulder has better alignment, and I'm trying to keep a posterior tilted pelvis. I want to have a lot of my lower back contacting the ground. When you do this with your athletes, you might want to put a towel under them and just give it a tug and just say, hey, keep this towel from moving, just to cue them to keep their lower back pinned into the ground. So this is just one example of a yielding internal rotation isometric. Now you can also do this at long lever for your yielding internal rotation isometric. And this also takes more load away from the shoulder. So it's now at a greater length and it's a little more mechanically disadvantaged when you're in that position as well. Because remember, we have a lot of force. We get the most force that goes through our arm in a long lever position to compress the shoulder joint. So we want to be able to train those features as well in different positions. So this is just a long lever isometric for internal rotation. Now, looking at SCAPTION, this is also a great exercise to train the external rotators as well, to keep your arm in the right position. But a SCAPTION yielding isometric, again, is an outstretched arm. I'm in a quadruped position. Again, I'm trying to keep a neutral spine. It's giving me a good core stability through this particular position. I'm getting some co-contraction from my other side of my body that's in contact with the ground. It's a great position, I feel, for developing just finger to shoulder strength for the back of your arm. And again, we need it in that long lever position when we have those highest compression stress. So we need to focus our training there. So when we look at our device with armcare.com, we have to look at this not just as a testing device, but also a training device. And the nice thing that we have is our strength tester function, and that allows you to do different isometric tests, but also get a number. That's a very difficult concept without this type of technology, to understand how much force your athletes are actually putting into a fixed surface. And so we have that, and it's quantified where you can give your athlete, especially understanding their max capacity, if you want to be able to do something that's more gradual or at lower levels. So it could be a day after pitching, you say, I want to do a low grade isometric protocol with the athlete. I want them to start with their isometrics, which I recommend because they're pain relieving, and state that, okay, your internal rotation strength, you have 48 pounds, and then essentially you could say, for this, I'd like you to go 50%. So 24 pounds, I want you to stay around 24 pounds with the strength tester function. I want you to do 10 reps of 5 seconds. You're going to get a lot of time under tension. You're going to get a lot more recruitment, and you're going to start to develop strength in an isometric way to help you during the co-contraction phases of throwing. And I believe that this is going to reduce the wear and tear on the arm because you have strength around making the transition from stretch to shortening. And if you have any questions, please contact us at support@armcare.com. Hey, if you got great videos on how you're training athletes and you're integrating isometrics, I'd like to show them either on our ArmCare IQs or put them on LinkedIn. I got a little bit of a community on LinkedIn that are really interested in this stuff. So, thanks for listening for this edition, and we look forward to the next one. Keep training smart, get isometrics in your program.